Now in today's video, I wanted to answer how much fondant do I need to use to cover my cakes? Well, in today's video, I've created this helpful guide. So no matter the width or the height of your cake or even your cake board, I've got you covered. So let's take a closer look. Now I've actually created two separate tables, one for the all-in-one method and also one for the paneling method. Now these are two different types of ways to cover your cakes and they do require slightly different amounts of fondant. The all-in-one method, you take one sheet of fondant and just go all the way over the top, and the paneling method, you do it in two sections. So you do the top and then you wrap the side separately. So you roll your fondant out a little bit different. So I have actually taken that into consideration with the tables. Now I will put a link in the description below so that you can download and print out these tables so you've always got them for reference. So first of all, I just wanted to say about the table, this is actually for a round cake. Now there are so many different brands of fondant. I have two here and you can also make your own. Now each of these has slightly different properties. So here I've got the Renshaw covering paste, which as you can see, just tears quite easily. And this is the sugar paste. Now this one is a lot harder out of the packet, so it needs to be kneaded and warmed up slightly. And as you can see, when warmed up, these ones are a lot more stretchy. Now I love working with both for completely different reasons, so it just comes down to personal preference in what type of fondant you want to use on your cakes. Now fondants with slightly more elasticity to them, you can roll out a little bit thinner, but I always like to keep my fondant around 4mm in thickness. I always think this gives you a nice amount of fondant to work with, but it's not too thick. Now if I'm covering a cake board, I like to have it a little bit thinner, so it's usually around 3mm. Okay, so if we take a look at the chart, along the side we have the diameter of your round cake, and this is in inches. Along the top we've got the height of your cake. So I've started with 0 and we've actually gone to 10 inches. So if you're doing quite a high cake or a double barrel cake, this is going to be up here. Now the reason that I've started with 0 is this is actually going to be for covering your cake balls. So you're not actually going to need to add any height. Now the only difference with this column that I mentioned was the thickness of your fondant needs to be rolled out at around 3mm, whereas the rest is 4mm for covering your cake. So here I've got a cake board, so I'm going to give you just a little example. So this is a 9-inch cake board. So I'm going to come down to 9 inches and it says we need 236 grams of fondant. Now, by knowing the exact amount of fondant that I need, I'm able to colour my fondant and know that I'm not going to have a super amount of excess left over. Now, I'm going to start with my fondant in a ball, and this is really important when covering a round cake board or a round cake, as this is going to help us keep it in shape. So I'm going to start to roll that out and then turn it round, and I'm going to continually keep turning, which is going to help me keep the fondant as round as I can. If it starts going out of shape, you can just use your hands and just pull that back in. Now I've been using some guides on the end of my rolling pin, and these are the 3mm guides. Now you don't need to use these, but I just wanted to make sure for this video I was rolling it out to the right thickness. So my fondant for my board is now 3mm. If I bring my board back in and just lay that on top, you can see that we just have a small amount of excess. Now this piece of small excess is important, especially with covering the board, as it's almost impossible to roll your fondant into the exact circle you need. So it just allows for the shape to be a little bit irregular. I'm just going to add a little bit of water over the top of my cake board to help that stick. Now I do have a few more videos that go into a little bit more detail about covering your cake boards and creating different designs on the top of your fondant. So I will put a link to these in the description below in case you're interested. So there we have your cake board all covered in your fondant, and we're left with a really minimal, small amount of excess. You could use this to create some decorations for your cake, but if you did want to store it in order to use on the next cake you're going to make, all you need to do is first of all just wrap it in some cling film. I always find the best way to keep it nice and soft and stop it going hard is to pop it into an airtight container. Now you could use a glass airtight container, these always work really well, or I like to save my tubs. So if you have tubs that you get with modeling paste, or maybe you've bought a brand of fondant that comes in tubs, this is going to keep it nice and soft until the next time you want to use it. Okay, so we've used our fondant chart to work out how much fondant we need to cover a cake board. Now I'm going to show you how to work out how much fondant you need if you're covering a cake. So here I've just got a round vanilla sponge cake which I've filled and covered in a layer of ganache ready for my fondant. When covering your cakes in fondant, you can fill and cover your cakes in buttercream, but ganache does firm up slightly more than buttercream. This means that when you're working on your cake, smoothing out those sides and getting a nice sharp edge with that fondant around the top, ganache just gives you a lot more time to work on it. Now, if you are new to covering your cakes in fondant, it's incredibly important that you spend time preparing your cakes. So making sure you get a nice level cake with a nice smooth finish of either buttercream or ganache on the outside. This is super important as any imperfections can really show through on that layer of fondant. So now our cake is ready, we can now use our table to work out how much fondant we need to use. So the first thing I need to do is just measure my cake. So my cake is 5 inches in diameter and I've ended up with a height of 5 inches. Now, if it was over 5 inches but not quite 6 inches, I would round it up just so we've got enough fondant. Okay, now I'm going to be covering my cake in the all-in-one method, so just one sheet of fondant. So my cake is 5 inches in diameter and 5 inches in height. So I'm going to need 707 grams of fondant. I'm just adding in a little bit of food gel. I'm going to make this one a slightly lighter pink. So now we've got our ball of fondant. I've just popped down some corn flour just to stop that fondant sticking. You want to constantly move that fondant around, just creating as much of a circle as you can. Now, the way that I've worked out how much fondant you need is when you're covering your cake, you want to roll out your fondant until it's large enough to drape over your entire cake. So for this cake, that's 15 inches across. So this is a thickness of 4 millimeters. I'm going to pick that fondant up, and I always like to just make sure that it's touching the board as I flip it over. And you always want to make sure that that top edge you secure in place before anything else, as this is the weakest point. Then we need to smooth it out. I'm just going to push that fondant onto the cake. Now, as you can see, by doing this method, you are left with this excess fondant at the bottom. Now, if I was to reduce the amount that we used, when we place the fondant over the top, it wouldn't actually come to the bottom, which would mean that when you were pulling it out to smooth it down, you were actually having to stretch it. And this would mean that you'd have less at the top, and there would be more of a chance of you weakening this point and it ripping down. So you're always going to end up with this excess at the bottom. I can then trim off the excess, and I'm just going to store this how I did before, just wrapping it in cling film, popping it in my airtight container just to use it on another cake. I'm then going to go in with my paddle smoothers and my flexi smoothers, just really getting a nice finish on my cake. Now, in this video, I realized that I'm not going into much detail, showing you how to actually prepare your cake and how to cover it in fondant and get nice smooth sides and sharp edges on the top. Now, I do have a more detailed step-by-step video that I will leave a link to in the description below. I also have a video on how to cover your cakes using the paneling method, which I will also leave a link to if you want to try this out. So here we have 2 different examples of how you can work out how much fondant you need for your round cakes and also your round cake balls using my fondant chart. I really hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial and you will find it useful the next time you work with fondant. If you have enjoyed the video, please don't forget to hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. So until next time, bye.